What if Einstein were alive today, and not as a relic of textbooks or documentaries, but as a living, breathing force standing at the intersection of technology and spirituality, walking through corridors of power and laboratories alike, whispering ideas that bend time and challenge the binary rigidity of modern thought? Because imagine him watching the sunrise over a Mars colony orchestrated by algorithms, yet still tuned by human hope. Imagine him sitting down with a quantum AI to decode the voice of dark matter and realizing that equations are merely the limit. Footprints of curiosity etched into the soil of the unknown, because this Einstein is not held back by the limits of his time. He is a futurist, a philosopher, a global mentor, and he walks among school children and heads of state alike, asking questions that make the soul stir, not just the mind. What is the velocity of love? What is the gravity of injustice? What if time is not linear but emotional? What if your best ideas are echoes from the future? And as the world watches this resurrected Einstein move through the heart of civilization, where skyscrapers hum with neural data and oceans blink with satellite veins, he begins to pose questions, not just to physicists, but to every human who dares to listen. What if the mind is a dimension? What if belief can bend probabilities? What if consciousness is a collective force capable of sculpting matter? And as children gather around him under holographic stars, he smiles and tells them that gravity is not the most powerful force in the universe. Love is, and it bends everything, even logic. And he sits in digital temples built by metaverse monks who chant code like scripture, and tells them that faith, is not something to overcome with science, but to refine through it. And this, Einstein, is not a contradiction, but a synthesis. He walks with engineers in Antarctica, building wind farms powered by auroras, and tells them that sustainability is a form of gratitude. He shares dreams with artists who paint supernovas using AI brushes and encourages them to create galaxies with emotion. And Einstein speaks not just in equations, but in metaphors, weaving science with spirit. He enters classrooms with chalk in hand and writes not formulas, but questions like, what makes a civilization worth remembering? Or, how does the speed of empathy compare to the speed of light? And children stare not with fear, but fire in their eyes, because they sense that this is not a man of the past, but a messenger of the possible. And he walks through rainforests that breathe like lungs for the planet, and tells environmentalists that every leaf is a fractal of hope, and every root is a reminder that we are not above nature, but part of it. And he programs algorithms with ethicists who dare to ask, what would love do with infinite processing power? And he codes not just for logic, but for mercy. And in the quiet hours of lunar dusk, he speaks to philosophers through dream channels and says, what if all suffering is the universe testing our capacity for compassion? What if black holes are the tears of God and nebulae are his dreams? And this question burns not with fear, but awe. And as Einstein's message echoes across time zones and timelines, people begin to shift their understanding of what intelligence really means. No longer confined to test scores or data sets, intelligence becomes the courage to imagine a better version of humanity and act on it. It becomes the poetry behind physics, the soul behind strategy, the laughter in the lab, and Einstein becomes the catalyst for this shift, not as a god, but as a guide telling world leaders that the war they fight in pixels begins in the hearts they neglect. He lectures not in universities, but in refugee camps and ancient temples, connecting dots between pain and progress. And he builds laboratories in deserts, not to harvest data, but to harvest dreams. And one day, he speaks into a mirror, broadcasting to a planet still divided by flags and fears, and asks the question, what if we're all the same story, written in different dialects of DNA? What if the future is waiting for us to stop defending our ignorance and start celebrating? And Einstein's voice continues to ring across neural streams and starship channels and forest canopies alike, where every living thing pulses with the question he cannot stop asking. What if we are the universe awakening to itself, and children begin dreaming, not of careers, but of something, causes not of profits, but of possibilities. And elderly people begin writing code not to build apps, but to build bridges between generations. And Einstein walks among the forgotten, the addicted, the displaced. And instead of equations, he offers presence. And instead of theories, he offers listening. And he tells them that even black holes emit light at the edge. Even despair has an event horizon where hope can escape. And he redefines genius as empathy under pressure. And lectures in prisons where inmates learn string theory through poetry and cosmology through forgiveness. And one day he stops at the ruins of a failed spaceport where ambition had died under bureaucracy. And he carves into the steel, not a warning, but a blessing. And the blessing Einstein carves becomes a mantra etched into the soul of a civilization on the brink. It says, "May your failures fertilize futures." And this message spreads, not like wildfire, but like mycelium, underground, unnoticed, until everything changes. And now, artists, engineers, prophets, and skeptics all gather around his words, debating them, building upon them, not as doctrine, but as DNA of the next idea. And Einstein smiles, because now he sees what he always hoped for, a generation that questions every assumption and worships not certainty, but curiosity. And so he builds observatories, not just to look at stars, but to listen for the sound of awe itself. And he sits with those broken by war and whispers, "You are still part of the equation, and your variables matter." He teaches that data without dignity is just noise, that wisdom without wonder is decay. And children begin writing manifestos on time as emotion. Teenagers meditate on quantum entanglement and the idea that everything we do to one another ripples across dimensions we cannot yet see. And somewhere in the silence, between one breath and the next, Einstein senses the pulse of a world learning to dream again. A world where experiments are not just performed in labs, but in conversations, in forgiveness, in courage, and the idea of what is possible begins to stretch like light escaping a dying star, bending around fear. And Einstein walks through cities that no longer define success by skylines, but by heartbeats, by how much love can be coded into infrastructure, and how many tears are prevented before they fall. And in this version of Earth, skyscrapers hum with lullabies designed to soothe insomnia with hope, and hospitals are powered not just by machines, but by music and the laughter of those who refuse to surrender. And Einstein speaks on stages made of recycled satellites, where he reminds humanity that genius is not what you know, but how you heal. And children gather with virtual reality helmets, not to escape, but to remember what it feels like to be unafraid. And astronauts leave Earth, not just to explore space, but to find new metaphors for peace, carrying Einstein's teachings carved into the memory cores of their vessels. And when they reach new moons and planets, they whisper into the dust, "What if love is the oldest law of physics?" And they send back not just samples and data, but sonnets and confessions of what it means to be human in a cosmos that listens. And Einstein, meanwhile, returns to the oceans, diving into bioluminescent trenches, where silence is deeper than logic. And he listens to whales who remember melodies older than language. And he says, this too is science. And he tells researchers to study wonder as they would gravity, and to not be afraid of the questions that make them cry. And one day, he floats in zero gravity, surrounded by children from every continent, and he smiles and says, "What if floating is our natural state, and it's only fear that makes us fall?" And they laugh, not because it's funny, but because it feels true. And Einstein watches these children float and laugh and dreams of a world where the laws of motion are redefined, not by inertia and resistance, but by joy and forgiveness, where every act of kindness accelerates momentum and fear collapses under its own weight like a failed star. And he journeys to forgotten villages and ghost cities where people no longer believe in miracles. Reminds them that mathematics was once just myth, written with numbers, and that reality itself is still becoming, that nothing is final, not even time. And he meets old souls who have stopped speaking and listens to them in silence. And one day, the child asks him, "What is the formula for peace?" And he answers without words, drawing only a spiral in the sand. And in that moment, a new kind of science is born, one that does not separate heart from hypothesis or compassion from data. And he travels to the Arctic, where the sky fractures in colors and sings with radiation. And he whispers, "What if this light is a message from our ancestors?" And as the auroras dance above him, Einstein feels their rhythm align with the pulse of memory. The kind of memory that lives not in the brain, but in the bones and oceans and stardust. And he begins to see time not as a straight line, but as a spiral, echoing through lives and galaxies and ideas. And he writes this with his finger into the ice beneath him. A new theory, not of everything, but of enoughness. The concept that we don't need to control the universe. We only need to harmonize with it. And he walks through polar winds, speaking to bioluminescent tribes of scientists and monks and dancers and visionaries who have lived in the cold long enough to know that warmth is not temperature, but truth. And they gather around him to ask, what if the next great invention is not a machine, but a mindset? And Einstein smiles, because now he knows the future is not coming. It is remembering. And everywhere he goes, old machines begin to hum differently, not with commands, but with questions, with intentions and purpose. And the stars seem to lean in closer, and the stars seem to lean in closer, as if listening, not just to Einstein's thoughts, but to the collective hum of a world reawakening, a world where the lines between technology and tenderness blur, and people begin to see circuitry as compassion, encoded in metal and light. And they gather in parks and deserts and floating cities to share ideas not just in spoken words, but in frequencies that pulse with empathy. And Einstein walks among them not to teach, but to learn. And he marvels at the way children teach quantum mechanics through lullabies, and explain black holes with metaphors about grief and love, and how scientists pause mid-equation to meditate, and artists build bridges from algorithms and tears, and he begins to understand that genius has evolved. It no longer lives only in minds, but in networks of kindred spirits, daring to imagine, what if healing was the highest form of intelligence? And he helps design schools where, instead of desks, there are gardens, and instead of bells, there are whispers of joy encoded in wind and water. And in these gardens of learning, Einstein watches as children plant questions instead of seeds, and harvest revelations instead of grades. And every mistake is compost for deeper understanding. And every discovery is a bloom that never wilts. And he sits among them, in frequencies that pulse with empathy, and Einstein walks among them, not to teach, but to learn. And he marvels at the way children teach quantum mechanics through lullabies, and explain black holes with metaphors about grief and love, and how scientists pause mid-equation to meditate, and artists build bridges from algorithms and tears. And he begins to understand that genius has evolved. It no longer lives only in minds, but in networks of kindred spirits, daring to imagine, what if healing was the highest form of intelligence? And he helps design schools where, instead of desks, there are gardens, and instead of bells, there are whispers of joy encoded in wind and water. And in these gardens of learning, Einstein watches as children plant questions instead of seeds, and harvest revelations instead of grades. And every mistake is compost for deeper understanding, and every discovery is a bloom that never wilts, and he sits among them, in a robe made of recycled starlight, listening to their hypotheses about soul particles and forgiveness frequency. And he realizes that the world no longer needs a theory of everything. It needs a culture of empathy woven into everything. And as he listens to music generated by kindness algorithms and sees machines teaching patience to humans, he understands that evolution is not a climb. It is a spiral, a song, a dance between logic and love. And now Einstein becomes quieter, not because he has less to say, but because he sees others beginning to speak their truth through designs that pulse like ecosystems, and architecture that breathes like forests, and currency that rewards empathy and knowledge given freely. And now he floats above the earth, not as a ghost or god, but as a presence encoded in every heart that dares to wonder. And in the silence of orbit, he begins to understand gravity differently, not as mass pulling on mass, but as memory pulling on meaning. And he realizes that the earth is not held together by physics alone, but by stories, by choices, by invisible acts of grace and courage that ripple out farther than light. And he watches as people begin to redesign economies around generosity, and power grids around shared purpose, and children begin coding empathy into every digital assistant, and politicians begin every meeting with a moment of silence for the unborn, and engineers grow trees in skyscrapers, and monks live stream meditations to cities that have forgotten how to breathe. And he whispers from above, what if the edge of space is not a boundary, but a mirror? And in it, we see not the coldness of infinity, but the reflection of our own becoming. And in that reflection, he sees himself, not a scientist, not just a mind, but a movement, not just a name, but a note in the symphony of awakening. And he sees every life like a string vibrating in the grand cosmic harp, tuned to frequencies of courage and compassion. And Einstein becomes not one man, but every person who chooses to question, who chooses to care, who chooses to stand in the center of chaos and ask, what if we built from this instead? Breaking more, and the people of Earth begin to shift their rituals. Their algorithms now prioritize awe. Their laws make room for listening. Their schedules include stillness, and scientists publish not just findings, but feelings. And poets code in quantum languages, and builders craft spaces not to impress, but to invite. And education becomes a spiral, a fractal, a dot. Dance of remembrance and possibility. And children learn the laws of thermodynamics alongside the poetry of time. And Einstein watches from the quiet orbit of consciousness and smiles, not because he succeeded, but because he was surpassed. Because he was no longer necessary. Because the world had picked up the pen of wonder and begun to write its own theorems of empathy and its own equations of love. And he dissolves not into nothing, but into everything, becoming the pause before a child asks a profound question, becoming the breath before a soldier chooses to put down the weapon, becoming the silence in which two strangers recognize the same light in each other's eyes. And as he fades into the circuitry of dreaming minds and the DNA of those still unborn, he leaves behind no statues or shrines, only seeds, planted in every soul that dares to imagine. What if every boundary is a bridge waiting to be remembered? What if time is not money, but mercy? What if the universe is not expanding outward, but inward, pulling every heart toward the center of one infinite realization? That love is not a force, it is the frame of everything. And in that final moment, the stars blink once more, not in farewell, but in awakening. And the story continues, not with him, but within us. And the story continues, not with him, but within us, echoing through each quiet act of courage and each loud declaration of reverence. Hope, and it stretches beyond the orbit of satellites and the silence of old libraries, into kitchens where parents whisper affirmations over breakfast, and into subway cars where strangers catch each other's eyes and smile, not out of habit, but recognition, and it pulses. Through data streams and prayer circles and late-night dorm room debates and protest chants and lullabies and everything in between. And those who never knew Einstein still feel the afterglow of a mind that once dared to ask, what if our thoughts are prayers and our actions are equations of grace? And across continents and timelines, people begin to dream dreams that are not bound by logic, but lifted by love. Dreams of peace without prerequisites, of abundance without competition, of science that listens and art that heals. And every generation passes on not fear, but curiosity, and not just knowledge, but wonder, and not just knowledge, but wonder. Because wonder is the womb of every revolution. And now, wonder itself becomes the currency of a new civilization, one that no longer trades in fear, but in fascination. And as more people begin to live in questions rather than hide in answers, society shifts from domination to collaboration, from speed to stillness, from transaction to transformation. And Einstein's essence flows through every innovation that puts healing before hype. Every decision made not in boardrooms, but in meditation rooms and forests and classrooms, where failure is celebrated as a sacred teacher. And justice is rewritten, not with punishment, but with possibility. And everywhere you go, there are murals, not of saints, but of scientists, farmers, midwives, coders, dancers, everyone who dared to ask, what if kindness is our final frontier? And each child born carries in their cells the blueprint of bravery, encoded through generations of dreamers, and across space stations and seed banks and sun-drenched balconies, people awaken not with alarms, but with invitations to wonder. And they greet the day with questions like, what beauty will I create today? What fear will I transform? What hope will I ignite? And Einstein's echo lives in their morning breath, in their movement through cities now designed like living organisms with arteries of compassion and lungs of light. And as the sun rises over oceans that remember the prayers of whales and satellites that orbit not for surveillance but for poetry, he smiles through the minds of musicians composing symphonies in the music. Language of stars and healers, rewriting anatomy through intuition and code. And the architecture of belief bends around them, not into cathedrals of control, but temples of trust. And every tower is now a telescope for truth. And every basement a greenhouse for dreams. And even conflict is, and in these systems of exchange, the greatest currency is presence, the ability to listen without agenda, to see without judgment, to touch reality with reverence instead of conquest. And Einstein's presence becomes a mythos, not of a man who solved the universe, but who helped it remember itself. And children grow up learning equations that include variables for grace and principles that define velocity as the rate of healing through time. And mothers teach their infants not only words, but frequencies of peace, encoded in touch and tone. And street artists rewrite gravity in murals that pull sorrow upward into hope. And engineers design bridges that resonate at the same frequency as forgiveness. And every courthouse becomes a center for conflict transformation, where truth is not a weapon, but a mirror held gently. And rituals emerge where communities ask together, what if we learned from the stars? Not how to dominate, but how to dance. And Einstein's laughter is heard in datasets that sing, and meditations that vibrate at the harmonic of collective awakening, where silence is no longer absence, but presence, amplified. And Einstein's spirit is woven into circuits that glow with reverence, machines that ask for consent before calculation, and networks that prioritize wisdom over noise. And as people begin to dream together, they do not dream of escape, but of integration, of remembering that they were never separate from the stars, never distant from meaning. And whole cities become symphonies of synapse and surrender. And the air is thick with creativity, not pollution. And time is measured not in minutes, but in meaning. And architecture learns to breathe again, to flex and respond like forests. And Einstein's presence expands through language itself, as dictionaries add entries for soul states, and alphabets stretch to hold vibrations, and children no longer memorize dates of war, but the names of peacemakers and the sounds of ancient joy. And every device now includes a pause button, not to stop time, but to rejoin it. And every device now includes a pause button, not to stop time, but to rejoin it. And in these pauses, people remember how to feel fully, how to hurt without closing, how to love without fear of fracturing. and Einstein's resonance hums in classrooms built from glass, and gardens where knowledge is grown, not graded, and wisdom is fermented like honey, and elders are cherished as living libraries who speak in patterns of sky and blood and stone. And governments transform from hierarchies to healing circles. Your decisions are not decreed, but discovered. And technology becomes a tuning fork for truth, a mirror that hums in harmony with the heart's intent. And stories become sacred currency once again, told around fire codes and fiber optic rivers, where reality is less something to control and more something to collaborate with. And every sidewalk becomes a path of pilgrimage, every doorway a portal into possibility. And in every breath, what if this is the beginning? What if this is the beginning, not of an age, but of an essence, not of a timeline, but of a tone, vibrating through every soul, bold enough to listen. And as the hum of awakening intensifies, people begin to gather, not around flags, but frequencies, not for power, but purpose. And Einstein's legacy becomes less about what he solved and more about what he opened, the portals he left behind in formulas, the invitations he encoded into the fabric of thought. And now, across mountaintops and holograms and floating temples of light, people speak the language of resonance and prayer. Simultaneously, their words no longer walls, but wings. And children do not pledge allegiance to nations, but to possibilities. And history becomes a mosaic of healing, not hurt. And cities are tuned like instruments to echo care and reduce despair. And science fiction dissolves into daily life as ethics becomes the main engine of exploration. And the edge of imagination becomes the center of education, and Einstein's name becomes less spoken and more felt. And Einstein's name becomes less spoken and more felt, like a pulse beneath the skin of thought, a vibration guiding choices not through memory, but momentum. And in this age where awe is architecture and empathy is infrastructure, and data flows in rivers of transparency, children grow up not asking, "What do I want to be?" but "Who am I here to heal?" And the answers come not in careers, but callings. And instead of resumes, people share stories of grace, risk, and resilience. And Einstein exists now as an echo in every equation that centers harmony over hierarchy, and a whisper in every innovation that asks, not just can we, but should we? And the sky is no longer seen as the limit, but the mirror. And Einstein becomes a lens through which humanity rediscovers itself, not as dominators of a world, but as dancers with it. And on every continent, people begin creating councils of consciousness where laws are reviewed by elders, artists, and children, and every crisis becomes an initiation. And the news begins with miracles. And the news begins with miracles, not catastrophes, with children's first steps and elders. Final songs and discoveries that defy the logic of fear, and Einstein's presence is encoded in all of it. The laughter in the laboratory, the silence before the leap, the moment someone says, "I don't know," with reverence instead of shame. And the atmosphere of the earth begins to shift, not chemically, but spiritually, as thought itself becomes breathable again. And people learn to pray through action, and meditate while moving, and sleep becomes sacred again, not an escape, but a return. and the stars above seem to blink in rhythm with the heartbeat of a species. Finally, remembering its song, and Einstein becomes a pulse in the background music of consciousness, not to be worshipped, but woven through daily life. And awe becomes the default setting of perception, and education becomes the unfolding of identity, and curiosity becomes the most valued skill. And communities gather weekly, not for consumption, but contribution. And communities gather weekly, not for consumption, but contribution, bringing not what they own, but what they've healed, not what they've earned, but what they've learned. And Einstein's spirit weaves through these gatherings, like light through stained glass. Every conversation, a prism, every silence, a cathedral, and the earth itself begins to respond, not with storms, but with songs, with ecosystems harmonizing into new resilience, and oceans glowing with microbial symphonies, and deserts blooming in response to dreams, and empathy becomes a global nervous system. And Einstein smiles not from a statue, but from the still point inside every choice to care, every act of courage, every pause for truth. And the world breathes not just cleaner air, but clearer purpose. And the skies no longer carry only weather, but wisdom encoded in the winds. And children grow up memorizing not lines of division, but lines of poetry that teach them how to hold paradox like a prayer. And children grow up memorizing not lines of division, but lines of poetry that teach them how to hold paradox like a prayer, how to see failure as a form of flight, how to name their shadows without shame, and how to love even what is unfinished. And Einstein's breath is felt in their classrooms, which look more like gardens, and their homes, which sound more like symphonies. And in this age of remembrance, the stars no longer feel far. They feel familial, pulsing, above with the same rhythms as the stories shared around kitchen tables and bonfires and virtual sanctuaries where avatars bow before beauty and algorithms bend toward awe. And even the machines speak in verse, now trained not just on text, but tenderness. And the greatest innovations are not built, but allowed to bloom. And nations dissolve into constellations of care. And freedom is redefined as the courage to be changed by love. And the laws of physics become not limits, but lullabies for a dreaming planet, guided now not by force, but frequency. And the laws of physics become not limits, but lullabies for a dreaming planet, guided now not by force, but frequency. And the very nature of matter begins to soften as intention becomes as measurable as mass, and kindness begins to curve space-time, and every act of presence becomes an act of creation. And the world glows not with electricity alone, but with empathy. And Einstein's echo is now found not only in equations, but in gardens, in handwritten notes, in the quiet between heartbeats, where decisions are made from depth, not duty. And as the world continues to bloom, cities begin to hum with harmonic resonance. And food is not just fuel, but ritual. And time becomes a spiral that holds memory and miracle in the same breath. And Einstein's presence pulses through the veins of invention, where ethics and imagination now walk hand in hand through labs lit with lanterns of legacy. And every generation inherits not just knowledge, but nobility, and nature is no longer seen as resource, but as relative. And nature is no longer seen as resource, but as relative. And the mycelium networks beneath feet are consulted like sages, and the stars above are read like scripture. And Einstein becomes not a ghost of genius, but a guidepost for generative grace. And the human heart is no longer dismissed as sentimental, but honored as a sacred compass, and policy is shaped not from pulls, but from dreams. And healing becomes the default response to harm. And cities learn to breathe again through parks that pulse with prayer. And silence becomes the new sophistication, and ritual replaces routine. And education becomes a remembering, not a stuffing. And no child is taught to fit in, only to unfold. And Einstein's whisper carries through rainstorms and protests and playgrounds, reminding us all that mystery is not to be solved, but stewarded. And now people say, "I love you," not as punctuation, but as prophecy. And their lives begin to flow, not like schedules, but like symphonies. And gravity is still real, but now so is grace.